Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my must-draft wide receivers for the 2022 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're talking about 5 wide receivers who are coming off of draft boards between the late second and early fourth rounds. Players that, regardless of how I start my respective draft, I find to be extremely valuable prospects because not only are they all upper-tier wide receiver 2s, but they could very easily all end up being wide receiver 1s when it's all said and done at the end of the 2022 season. Now, before I begin rattling off stats and giving you guys some facts regarding these players, I of course want to remind you, if you have not yet already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We are making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2022 season. So if you're trying to gain an edge on your league mates and of course help yourself win a 2022 fantasy football championship, subscribe down below and of course help us reach our next goal. 60,000 subscribers would be an incredible achievement, so help us get there. Thank you very much. Also, for those of you who have not yet already, check out Underdog Fantasy. Underdog Fantasy is another way to gain an advantage on your respective leagues because it's giving you an outlet to go ahead and mock draft, preparing you for your upcoming draft with a multitude of best ball tournaments. You can get yourself prepared by trying different draft strategies and playing against the best in the industry. So if you're interested, be sure to go down below, check out the link. If you go ahead and sign up today using promo code Andrew, Underdog Fantasy is willing to match up to $100 of your first deposit. Again, whether it's dropping $100 and getting that $100 match or potentially just giving it a try with a $20 deposit, $20 match, and drafting yourself upwards of 10 puppy teams. Again, that's 10 mock drafts where you're not only gaining yourself experience, but potentially putting your hat in the ring to winning some big prizes. So go ahead and check that out today. Thank you very much. So let's go ahead and let's start talking about these wide receivers, beginning with Michael Pittman Jr., wide receiver for the Indianapolis Colts. Currently on Underdog Fantasy, he is coming off of the draft board around an ADP of 28.6. So let's say he's the 29th pick off of the board. That means he's, early third round, which is great overall value based on what I'm about to tell you. Now, when we go into the 2022 season, there is going to be a huge difference as to the Michael Pittman of old and new. Last season, his quarterback was, of course, Carson Wentz. The difference between Carson Wentz and Matt Ryan, in my opinion, is going to be ginormous. And the reason why is because Matt Ryan knows how to use a number 1 dominating wide receiver. And he has shown that in the past in his days at Atlanta. I mean, let's look at what Julio Jones did between 2011 through 2020. Julio Jones was averaging 15.7 fantasy points per game in the 131 games that he played with Atlanta. 9.97 targets per game, 97 receiving yards. And I understand, Michael Pittman Jr. is not Julio Jones. Julio Jones is a future Hall of Famer, but I'm just giving you some perspective in terms of the opportunity that was being given to a wide receiver that was the number 1 on Matt Ryan's given team. Now, if you want to take it a step back, let's talk about Calvin Ridley. Between 2018 through 2021, Calvin Ridley played 47 games for this team. Okay, a lot of those games with Julio Jones in the lineup, yet Calvin Ridley was averaging 7.94 targets per game. But when you went ahead and you removed Julio from the lineup, in the 13 contests that Calvin Ridley played by himself with Matt Ryan, Calvin Ridley was averaging 14.28 fantasy points per game and 10.85 targets per game. A lot of opportunities were given to the number 1 threat of a Matt Ryan-led offense, and that wasn't really much of a surprise and shouldn't surprise us. I mean, that's just been the case over the last decade. Since 2008, the number 1 receiving target of a Matt Ryan-led offense has averaged 155 targets, 96 receptions, 1,388 yards, and 7 receiving touchdowns per season. If you go ahead and you start from Roddy White to Harry Douglas to Julio Jones, Calvin Ridley, then to Kyle Pitts, the number 1 targets are always having themselves great seasons, and a top-tier talent like Michael Pittman is only going to flourish because of the implementation of a Matt Ryan-led passing attack in comparison to guys like Carson Wentz or an aged Phillip Rivers in years past. Now, as we continue to talk about Michael Pittman, I think it's extremely vital to kind of reference just how this Indianapolis Colts offense has used the wide receiver position in seasons past in comparison. For example, since Andrew Luck retired, years 2019 through 2021, the average passing attempts per season from the Indianapolis Colts has been 526. Now, in comparison to what Matt Ryan's had to do with the Atlanta Falcons, he's thrown 600 plus times a season in 8 out of the last 10 seasons he's played. Obviously, there's going to be a little bit of a dip in terms of the amount of times he throws the ball, but we don't really care about quantity. We care about the quality of those respective targets that are going to be going in the direction of a Michael Pittman Jr. So I'm not too worried about Matt Ryan dipping his overall numbers. As long as the ball is going into the direction of his number one receiving option, Michael Pittman Jr., I think all is going to be well. But this does bring up a great point in regards to how this Indianapolis Colts offense has functioned. Obviously, I've mentioned it in the past. Since 2018, since Frank Reich got to the Colts as their head coach, they have been the number one ranked team in terms of running back opportunities and have been the number 2 overall team in running back rushing attempts. Again, they're going to feed Jonathan Taylor. That is no question. But they're also going to continue to send the ball in the direction of Michael Pittman Jr. Now, last year, he had 129 total targets. If you go ahead and look at the entire history of the Indianapolis Colts as of late, that is the most targets a wide receiver has seen from the Colts since 2016 T.Y. Hilton. So obviously, the run-heavy scheme and the fact that they haven't had a dominant wide receiver one for the last couple years at a healthy rate led to the fact that this team didn't pass very much. They continue to run the ball. But now that you have the quarterback of choice and a top-tier wide receiver, I think the sky's the limit for each of them. Now, obviously on screen, you can see I did mention that as of the last 4 seasons, from 2018 through 2021, the Indianapolis Colts have had the 6th fewest wide receiver passing targets in the entire National Football League. They don't really throw the ball very much, so obviously their overall attempts going towards the wide receiver position when you had guys like Zach Pascal, being primary receiving options, were going to be lower. But nonetheless, I still think there is a lot of opportunity in this offense, especially considering guys like I just mentioned, Zach Pascal and T.Y. Hilton are no longer with this team. In fact, when you go ahead and you eliminate Zach Pascal, T.Y. Hilton, Jack Doyle, Marlon Mack, there is going to be a sufficient amount of opportunity available because there's 154 vacated offensive targets in comparison to last season. And yes, they are adding pieces. They drafted Alec Pierce out of Cincinnati. They brought in Jelani Woods, the former Virginia tight end from the NFL draft. They also have Paris Campbell coming back from his respective injury. And I'm hearing some things about Nyheim Hines being used more often in the passing game. But all that being mentioned, there is still a lot of opportunities for Michael Pittman's baseline of targets to increase. We could very easily see it, like I mentioned, get to that 150 range, like all number 1 wide receiver targets from the past Matt Ryan-led offenses in Atlanta all were able to do. Now, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, there is a conversation about having a high quantity of targets and a high quality of targets. But going into 2022 with Matt Ryan, I really do think that Michael Pittman can have the best of both worlds. There isn't very many wide receivers out here that are going to contest him from getting to 150 targets. Paris Campbell has only played 15 games since 2019, and all these other rookie receiving options are certainly going to have to compete with each other, but they're not always going to be on the field in 2 wide receiver sets when this team wants to come out with 2 tight ends. So in this circumstance, I really do think that the difference between Carson Wentz and Matt Ryan is going to certainly show. Obviously, Carson Wentz statistically was fine, 27 passing touchdowns, and of course 3,500 passing yards, but it's not going to really be those overall stats that is the difference maker. It's going to be the accuracy of the passes sent in his direction and the consistency in which they're thrown that are going to develop Michael Pittman to the wide receiver 1 conversation. Now, despite all that I've mentioned regarding Carson Wentz, he still ended up helping Michael Pittman be a great overall wide receiver. Last season, in games which Michael Pittman had 6 or more targets, he averaged 13.89 fantasy points per game. That was 11 of his overall contests, which is nearly 70% of the games. Like I mentioned with all prospects in fantasy football, the more opportunity they're given, the more potential for success they will find. And of course, when he's gone ahead and seen himself 6, 7, 8 targets, he's often found himself catching the ball very often. In games last season where he had 5 or more catches, he was averaging 14.1 fantasy points per game. That was also done in 11 games, which was nearly 70% of the time. So as I continue to do more and more research regarding Michael Pittman Jr.'s potential for 2022, again, playing against the AFC South, it's not that difficult of a division. I mean, he's not playing against Jalen Ramsey twice a year. Stephon Gilmore's on his team. He'll go ahead and practice against him and get those high tier reps. It's nothing that I am too afraid of. Again, he performed very well against that division last year, averaging 13.62 fantasy points per game in the 6 games against the AFC South in 2021. So all in all, there are more arguments for Michael Pittman than against him going into 2022. which seems like a thumbs up and a great overall pick currently at his ADP of the middle of the third round. Now, the final thing that I wanted to mention regarding Michael Pittman Jr. was how well he played against man coverage last season. According to Pro Football Focus, he was the 20th ranked wide receiver in terms of grades against man coverage. The other stat that I found regarding him this offseason is that when he had single one-on-one man coverage, he won on 66% of his routes, having one or more steps on the opposing cornerback that was covering him. Now, unfortunately, despite winning on 66% of those routes, he was only targeted 28% of the time. That is a relatively low number because when you go ahead and compare that against other wide receivers that found that level of success, for example, Mike Evans and Keenan Allen, they were all targeted 40+% of the time when they had that extra step against opposing cornerbacks in single man coverage. I think Matt Ryan will only elevate him and expose the weaknesses of defenses and elevate Michael Pittman to a wide receiver one standing in 2022. All right, let's move on to our next wide receiver. Another one that I'm extremely excited about. T. Higgins, currently coming off of underdog draft boards at an ADP of 24.3. So basically, the end of the second and the beginning of the third round. Now, let's give a little bit of history regarding T. Higgins. Obviously, he's a former second round selection in 2020. He was in the same draft class as Joe Burrow. In fact, in their rookie season, prior to Joe Burrow's injury, T. Higgins found himself a lot of success. From weeks 1 through 2, obviously he was still grasping the playbook and getting ready, did not play a very high level of snaps, but from weeks 3 through 10, T. Higgins was a dominant force his rookie season. In fact, was playing 78% of the snaps throughout the 7-game span and was averaging 14.3 fantasy points per game. So we knew Joe Burrow, T. Higgins, they have a connection. But as the 2020 season finished and we went into the 2021 season, we all saw Ja'Marr Chase get selected. And that forced T. Higgins down to a 6th round draft ADP. Now, for those of us who ended up drafting him in 2021, obviously that investment paid dividends. I understand he missed an early chunk of time due to an injury, but as soon as he came back, he was a dominant force. In the last 21 games with Joe Burrow under center, T. Higgins is averaging 13.44 fantasy points per game and 7.86 targets per game. Now, when they play against their division rivals in the AFC North, in the last 7 games that they've played, T. Higgins is averaging 17.4 fantasy points per game. Again, we know how great those secondaries are in that division, yet they still continue to find success. Now, the last stat that I wanted to mention before we move on to other statistics and talk about the comparisons between Ja'Marr Chase and T. Higgins is the potential pace that T. Higgins was setting last year. If, in fact, T. Higgins had not gotten injured and had played all 17 games in 2021, he would have had himself 220 plus fantasy points and been the number 9 overall wide receiver in fantasy. When you look at the last 10 games that T. Higgins played for the Cincinnati Bengals, including the playoffs, he had 7 games out of the last 10 with 95 or more receiving yards. We're talking about late year production that helped us win fantasy football championships. And really, I don't think it stops there. I think that continues in 2022. Now, obviously, the conversation is going to arise, as it should, between whether or not we should be going after Ja'Marr Chase or T. Higgins based on their current ADPs. Obviously, Ja'Marr Chase coming off of the board within the middle of the first round, while T. Higgins, like we mentioned, is coming off of the board late second, early third. When you go ahead and stat for stat compare their overall production with Joe Burrow under center, T. Higgins averages more targets per game, more receptions per game. And though last season T. Higgins averaged 11 yards less and 0.4 touchdowns less, the overall fantasy point differential in terms of averages isn't that big. It's 13.01 from last year for T. Higgins and 16.28 for Ja'Marr Chase. I think those numbers could very easily get closer, as Ja'Marr Chase found a lot of success when T. Higgins was not in the lineup last season. And when you put them together in the same offense, it is going to be a nightmare for defensive coordinators to try to stop both. And I'm sure both can find success on a weekly basis. Now, over the last 2 seasons, when T. Higgins has been given, his normal amount of targets per game, again, like I mentioned, he's averaged 7+ targets per game. When he's been given 7 or more targets, this man is averaging 15.7 fantasy points per game. That's 14 of the last 21 contests. That's 67% of the time. And when he's given those kind of opportunities, it's obviously going to lead to success, because anytime this man has caught the ball 5 or more times with Joe Burrow under center, he's averaged 16.77 fantasy points per game. Now, the final things that I wanted to mention regarding T. Higgins and his potential in 2022 has to do with Joe Burrow, the offensive line, and of course, how he played with Ja'Marr Chase at the back end of the 2021 year. First question regarding Joe Burrow. Obviously, the question is, can Joe Burrow help two wide receivers be top 12 at the position in 2022? Well, we have seen many other offenses and quarterbacks do this. In fact, in 2020, Minnesota and Seattle both produced two top 12 wide receivers, while in 2018, Pittsburgh and Minnesota did it again. And in 2016, New Orleans and Green Bay had two top 12 wide receivers. What all those quarterbacks had in common was a base minimum of 4,200 passing yards and 30 passing touchdowns in those given years. When you look at what Joe Burrow produced last year with the league's worst offensive line, 4,600 passing yards and 34 passing touchdowns is only going to rise. Maybe 5,000 passing yards, 40 passing touchdowns. We're talking about top tier quarterback play from Joe Burrow based on how this offensive line has been completely overhauled. Again, like I mentioned in regards to Joe Mixon, this offensive line has brought in three studs. Ted Karras, formerly of the New England Patriots, he's going to play center. They brought in Alex Kappa, formerly of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He's going to be the left guard. And of course, you have Lyle Collins, the right tackle, an absolute stud at the position. Just to put it in perspective, in 2021, Joe Burrow was sacked the most amongst all quarterbacks in the National Football League last year. His offensive line gave up a total of 70 sacks. Again, we all saw it in the NFL playoffs against Tennessee, against the Los Angeles Rams. And if you go ahead and improve this offensive line, the sky's the limit for his receiving options and, of course, Joe Burrow's overall potential. The final thing I wanted to mention, of course, T. Higgins versus Jamar Chase from weeks 8 through 17. Between that span of time, T. Higgins was the number 7 overall wide receiver, while Jamar Chase was the number 8 overall wide receiver. If you can find both these guys averaging 14 plus fantasy points per game, and Joe Burrow, who has already proven in the past that he can go ahead and develop two top 12 wide receivers throughout a large span of time, I have all the confidence in the world in T. Higgins in 2022, and I honestly think he should be drafted higher. Moving on, let's talk about Mike Williams, Chargers wide receiver, a guy that I mentioned a couple days ago in regards to the draft that I conducted. If you guys haven't checked out that video, I ended up selecting him in the late 3rd round. And I did mention a couple stats regarding him that I will repeat on today's episode, but it's just to kind of set a foundation as to how well Mike Williams played and how well he will continue to play throughout the future. Again, let's not forget, this is a man that inked a 3-year contract that is going to pay him a lot of money in the next couple years. Last season, in 2021, Mike Williams had career highs in passing targets with 129, career high in receptions with 76, receiving yards with 1,146, and was one total touchdown away from tying his career high of 10. Again, last year had 9 receiving touchdowns. Thanks to the contributions of Justin Herbert under center, Mike Williams has been able to develop and become this top tier wide receiver target. I mean, again, you know, you see what he was able to do with Phillip Rivers at times. Sure, he was a touchdown machine, but he was never in this top tier range of yardage and receptions since 2020. Now, Mike Williams is averaging 12.32 fantasy points per game in the 26 healthy games that he played. Now, with all that said, I understand. I can hear it already. I can read it in the comment section in my mind's eye. I can see it already being typed out. Andrew, Mike Williams was great between weeks 1 through 5. We'll give you that, but for the rest of the season, he was awful. Now, let's talk about it. Weeks 1 through 5 of the 2021 season, he was literally the number 1 overall wide receiver in a half PPR scoring format, averaging 20.12 fantasy points per game and 10 targets per game over a 5-game stretch. Now, the rest of the season, a little bit of a downhill slope, as from week 6 through 18, with Justin Herbert, was the number 29 overall wide receiver, only averaging 9.82 fantasy points per game and only 7.09 targets per game through that 11-game stretch. Now, I understand it is very concerning to see, man, Andrew, he did not play well throughout that time. His targets dipped, his touchdowns dipped, and those were the biggest difference makers between his great weeks and his awful weeks. And I 100% agree with you. But with that said, we have to take into account just how many of the opportunities he was given and wasn't able to capitalize on, whether it was Justin Herbert's mistake or him potentially not being able to close the gap and oftentimes being tackled on the 1 or 2 yard line. I've watched the film, guys. There were so many opportunities last year where Mike Williams could have scored 3 or 4 extra touchdowns and wasn't able to get the job done, which would have made a giant difference. And of course, nonetheless, he was still a top 12 wide receiver in fantasy last year, but could have even been better. Last year, Mike Williams was targeted 19 times in the red zone. Overall, that led to 4 touchdowns. not the greatest touchdown number, especially considering he had 12 total targets from within the 10-yard line last year, which only led to 2 receiving touchdowns. When you compare that to all other wide receivers in the National Football League last year who had 12 or more targets from inside the 10-yard line, all of them had a minimum of 5 receiving touchdowns. Again, like I mentioned, there are 3 to 4 receiving touchdowns that Mike Williams should have had in his box score at the end of the 2021 season. And if he had, people wouldn't even be questioning him as a second-round pick. But yet, at times, you can get him at the late 3rd and early 4th, currently at an ADP of 30 on average via Underdog Fantasy. Now, even though the red zone didn't treat Mike Williams as well as we would have all wanted it to, he was still an incredible wide receiver on other aspects of the field. Again, as a deep threat last year, he had the 10th most targets of 20 or more yards down the field. That led to 11 receptions and 4 of his total touchdowns. Again, he is a major deep ball threat. And when we look at the quarterback that's attached to him, again, Justin Herbert was incredible passing the ball down the field last year. He had the 6th most completions of 20 or more yards down the field, which led to 1,056 yards and 9 of his passing touchdowns. Again, this is an offense that even in the first half of games didn't even want to throw the ball down the field. But as crunch time came upon them, they continued to air it out. Hopefully this year, Joe Lombardi is going to let one of the best deep ball passing quarterbacks in the league uncork his arm and just fire off cannons throughout the early half of these games, which will only unlock what Mike Williams can continue to do for this offense. Now, when we compare Mike Williams to other wide receivers, for example, T. Higgins, or maybe guys like Terry McLaurin, last season, he had the 3rd most contested passing targets in the National Football League, 41 total, in which he caught 21 of them. That's the 2nd most contested catches in 2021. When we're talking about a big wide receiver who is still being thrown the ball when he's covered and still making a lot of plays, that just continues to give me confidence that regardless of whether or not Justin Herbert sees him open, he is going to send the ball and believe that his stud wide receiver is going to come up with the ball. And he continued to do so all of last season, which continues to give me confidence in Mike Williams. Last season, he was the number 4 overall wide receiver in terms of snaps played on the outside, and he had the 12th most overall wide receiver air yards with 1,497 last season. Overall, the opportunity is there, the quarterback is there, and it's only going to get better for Mike Williams. I mean, again, Justin Herbert took great strides to improving from his rookie year through his sophomore year. Again, let's not forget, in his rookie year, there were no crowds, there were no noise. As a rookie quarterback, you could develop in that kind of a condition and still put up great numbers, but we tested that in 2021. He developed incredible numbers again, got even better. And now this offensive line's improved. The backfield's getting more depth. The defense has improved, which will allow this team to have short field opportunities and score even more touchdowns in 2022. Again, let's not forget, when Herbert has sent the ball in the direction of Mike Williams 6 or more times in a game, Mike Williams is averaging 15.72 fantasy points per game. That's 18 of the last 26 games. That's 70% of the time. When this guy has caught the ball 4 or more times, again, 4 catches for Mike Williams should be nothing. But in the games with Justin Herbert that he's caught the ball 4 or more times, he's averaging 16.27 fantasy points per game. That's 17 in the last 26 games. As long as he continues to get opportunities, I think the sky's the limit for Mike Williams. Can very easily repeat another wide receiver 1 season in 2022. Moving on to our 4th wide receiver, Courtland Sutton, currently coming off of Underdog draft boards as the number 35 player off the board. Now, a couple days ago, Tim Patrick had a season-ending ACL injury. Now, we all know Tim Patrick is a great contributing fantasy wide receiver, even though at times he was the number 3 on the Denver Broncos in seasons past. But regardless of his injury, it really hasn't changed my outlook on Courtland Sutton. I thought Courtland Sutton was going to be a stud nonetheless because of all the stats that I'm going to give you. I think Tim Patrick's absence only helps develop this conversation because more targets will be potentially available in a Russell Wilson-led offense. But let's talk about the history of Courtland Sutton. Again, in 2019, he was the number 19 overall wide receiver in a half PPR scoring format, having produced a season of 72 receptions, 1,100 receiving yards, and 6 receiving touchdowns, 186.42 fantasy points in that given year. Overall, a fantastic contribution from Courtland Sutton. And we all thought, going into 2020, he's going to for sure be a wide receiver 2 option regardless of Drew Lock being his quarterback. Now, unfortunately, the following season, he tore his ACL, and was out for the year. Again, he did it early in the season, and it was unfortunate, but it's just the nature of the sport. It could happen to anyone on any given play. Now, as we were approaching the 2021 season, there was a major discount for a guy like Courtland Sutton. Again, he was a proven wide receiver 2 in the past. He had an upgraded quarterback, and we all thought, Teddy Bridgewater could get the job done with the Denver Broncos and help Courtland Sutton take that next step forward after his recovery process. Now, early on in the season, everything that we thought of Courtland Sutton flourished. I mean, in week 1, there was a little bit of an establishing and kind of catching up process that he had to do. Didn't play as many snaps, but from weeks 2 through 6, this was a dominant wide receiver. In fact, from weeks 2 through 6 of the 2021 season, he averaged 10 targets per game and 14.74 fantasy points per game as the number 11 overall wide receiver throughout that span of time. In those 5 games, 3 of those games consisted of 10 or more targets. Now, for many of us who were experiencing having Courtland Sutton in our lineup last year throughout the span of time, we didn't really know that those 3 major performances of 10 or more targets were going to be the last good performances that we saw from him that year. In fact, between weeks 2 through 6, where Courtland Sutton was given 10 plus targets, those games accounted for 37 targets, 24 receptions, 373 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns, and 61.3 fantasy points. Those overall statistics, in the grand scheme of his entire 2021 year, accounted for 38% of his targets, 41% of his receptions, 48% of his receiving yards, and 100% of his touchdowns. He didn't score a single touchdown from there on forth. Again, like it says on screen, from week 7 through 18, he was the number 81 overall wide receiver, averaging 4 points per game. It's almost as if they've just forgot him. You went ahead and gave this man 10 targets per week, and then you go ahead and just ignore him. And he goes back to averaging 4.09 targets per game, yet averaging 86% of the offensive snaps, just ignoring him outright. It's crazy to me. But we know what he's capable of. And when given opportunity, he can play very well. I mean, from games that he played in 2019 and in 2021, when Courtland Sutton was given 7 plus targets, he averaged 11.89 fantasy points per game, 4 plus receptions, 12.83 fantasy points per game. We're not asking for much. And I certainly think we'll be able to get those bare minimum numbers now that Russell Wilson is in this offense. I mean, it is an incredible upgrade for wide receivers like Courtland Sutton and Jerry Jeudy, who are going to be the number 1 benefactors of Russell Wilson's presence. Again, if they let Russ cook, we're going to find incredible production because in 4 out of the last 5 seasons, Russell Wilson has had 31 plus passing touchdowns. Again, I say 4 out of the last 5. Last year didn't even count. He missed majority of the year with an injury. So really, in his last 4 healthy seasons, 31 plus touchdowns every single year. In fact, since 2015, he's averaged 2.0 passing touchdowns per game in his career. And not only that, this is a guy that has helped develop wide receiver 1s in the National Football League. Doug Baldwin, 2015, 16, and 17 was the number 8, 10, and 13 ranked wide receiver in half PPR. Tyler Lockett, from 2018, 19, 20, and 21 was the number 15, 14, 9, and 13th ranked wide receiver. And then we have DK Metcalf from 2020 through 2021 as the number 7 and 12th ranked wide receiver. Again, his primary targets in his offenses have never ranked lower than the number 15 overall wide receiver in a half PPR scoring format. That is an incredible number. And it only is going to help the argument of one Courtland Sutton and Jerry Jeudy as we kind of approach the 2022 season. Now, of course, we're going to have a bit of a coaching change. Nathaniel Hackett comes in. He's the former offensive coordinator of the Green Bay Packers. Of course, the Green Bay Packers were known for using Davante Adams at a high clip. You were going ahead and sending him a bunch of targets. And when we talk about comparables for Courtland Sutton in this offense, Davante Adams and DK Metcalf, big body wide receivers that are going to play on the outside, that is what Courtland Sutton is going to fit into this offense. And I'm expecting them to use him at that capacity. Obviously, not as talented as those other 2 wide receivers I mentioned, but is going to be filling their shoes. Now, when we compare a wide receiver like DK Metcalf to Courtland Sutton, we have to put it in perspective and find, how did DK Metcalf find so much success besides his own individual skill? Where was he most dominant on the field? Well, he found a lot of success, not only him, but also even Tyler Lockett. They found a lot of success in Seattle from the deep ball passing game. Now, over the course of the last 3 seasons, 2019 through 2021, DK Metcalf had 83 targets, 30 catches, 1,130 receiving yards, and 11 receiving touchdowns from targets 20 or more yards down the field. Not only did he find success, but Tyler Lockett had himself 83 targets, 38 receptions, 1,291 receiving yards, and 11 receiving touchdowns, 20 or more yards down the field. And that was all possible due to the skill of one Russell Wilson. Russell Wilson, over the course of the last 3 years, has been the best deep ball passing quarterback in the National Football League, as since 2019, he's accounted for the 3rd most passing attempts, 2nd most passing completions, 3,217 passing yards, which is the 2nd most amongst all quarterbacks, and 33 passing touchdowns, which is the most amongst all quarterbacks passing the ball 20 or more yards down the field. When you're at the top 3 of every single category and are obviously allowing your top tier wide receivers to be dominant forces in the deep ball passing game, what do we expect Courtland Sutton to do in this year? I mean, I expect him to take a huge leap forward in comparison to what he put forth in years past. Because again, don't forget, though Courtland Sutton has seen great opportunities in the deep ball game, 29 targets last year, 23 in 2019, the quality of those targets were not great. We're talking about low passing completion percentages from Drew Locks and, Teddy Bridgewaters, who weren't able to get the job done on a consistent basis. Again, when we think of Courtland Sutton, we think of a big-bodied wide receiver that is going to be a vertical threat in this offense. And, he's done it in years past, and he's done it effectively when given the opportunity. From receiving options that have had at least 300 routes ran in their career, if we look at the most yards per route run on vertical routes, Courtland Sutton is a top 5 receiver or receiving option in that category, only behind Gronkowski, Julio Jones, Justin Jefferson, and Deshaun Jackson. Courtland Sutton averaged 2.41 yards per route run on vertical routes in his career. There is so much potential for this young man to develop into a potential wide receiver 1. I think the sky's the limit for this Broncos offense. And if they truly do let Russ cook, let's ride. We're going to have ourselves a lot of fantasy points from Courtland Sutton as a 4th round draft selection. Moving on to our final wide receiver, we have A.J. Brown, who during the NFL draft was the biggest name that was kind of thrown out there as a crazy trade happened where the Tennessee Titans decided we're not going to pay our number 1 wide receiver. We would rather just get Treylon Burks and send A.J. Brown over to the Philadelphia Eagles, which I'm grateful for. I think he's going to make a perfect fit here. Obviously, he's a former 2nd-round pick in the 2019 season. In his young career thus far, he has already finished in 2019 as the number 15 overall wide receiver, in 2020 as the number 11 overall wide receiver, and though he only played 10 games last year, he finished as the number 32 ranked wide receiver in a half PPR scoring format. With Ryan Tannehill under center since 2019, A.J. Brown averaged 14.26 fantasy points per game. And this is going to be something that we continue to see in terms of high fantasy point averages based on how successful he was in this respective offense. Let's not forget, in terms of yards per route run since 2019, he's the number 4 wide receiver with 2.61 yards per route run average. He's the number 8 wide receiver in terms of yards per reception with 16.2. And he's the number 6 overall wide receiver in terms of yards after the catch per reception. On PFF, he graded as the number 5 overall wide receiver against man coverage in 2021. And in 2020, he was the number 3 ranked wide receiver at that category. Again, he is still amongst the top 2 wide receivers in the National Football League, but I understand why there is some hesitancy. Again, when you look at his career with the Tennessee Titans, he had a great amount of receiving touchdowns, 23 touchdowns in the 35 healthy games he played with Ryan Tannehill. That is an extremely high rate of touchdowns considering the low volume of targets he received in that respective offense. Over the course of his career with Ryan Tannehill under center, anytime A.J. Brown was given 6 or more targets in a game, he averaged 16.15 fantasy points per game. That's 27 of the 35 healthy games he played. That's 77% of the time. When he was given 4 or more receptions, of course, he's 15 plus fantasy points automatic. 26 of his 35 games. Again, there was so much potential for success from this young wide receiver, especially considering he was tearing apart the AFC South. I'm sure the AFC South is extremely glad that they don't have to face A.J. Brown twice a year. And when A.J. Brown was asked to be a top-level wide receiver in the most important games of the Tennessee Titans history over the last couple years, 2020 playoff game against the Baltimore Ravens, 10 targets, 6 catches, 83 yards, and a touchdown. He will make plays in big games. Against Cincinnati Bengals, this last playoffs. Of course, 9 targets, 5 catches, 142 yards, and a touchdown, 22.7 points. When given ample opportunity, he will deliver at the highest level of the wide receiver position. And again, like I mentioned, he's done it in seasons past. Now, the main topic of conversation this offseason regards whether or not the number 1 wide receiver of the Philadelphia Eagles could end up being an elite fantasy prospect. Because, of course, Jalen Hurts and the fact that this team does not throw the ball very much. But let me remind you, A.J. Brown was the number 1 wide receiver for a run-first offense. Not even just a run-first offense in general, but the run-first offense in the National Football League. No one has ran the ball more than the Tennessee Titans over the course of the last 4 seasons. No other team since 2018. Yet, a lot of people are worried about A.J. Brown going from one run-first offense to another. And I understand the difference between Ryan Tannehill and Jalen Hurts may show, but I still think that Jalen Hurts is just as capable of a quarterback to get the job done in this respective offense. Now, like I've gone ahead and demonstrated on screen, the 2021 Philadelphia Eagles were the number 2 team in terms of overall rushing attempts, had the most rushing yards amongst all teams in the National Football League with 2,700, and had the most rushing touchdowns. They averaged, the 4th highest yard per carry average in the National Football League last year with 4.9 yards per carry. When you're able to get a first down in 2 attempts, obviously this team is going to continue to run the ball as we, progress into the 2022 season. And obviously, the amount of passing attempts they had, 494, the league low, the fewest amongst all teams, is certainly a, prospect of concern. But just hear me out. When A.J. Brown finishes the 2022 season with about 110 to 125 total targets and is able to be a top-tier wide receiver because of the fact that he's got the easiest strength of schedule at the position. Again, we'll have the strength of schedule video coming down the line. The Eagles have the 4th easiest strength of schedule at the quarterback as well. This combination between A.J. Brown and Jalen Hurts is going to find so much success, not only because they're talented, but the prospects of playing against some of the easiest matchups on a weekly basis based on history of these defenses and the specific starters of each defense. It's going to speak volumes when they're putting up a bunch of points a week. You guys know how much of an importance I put on matchups on a weekly basis. I've already gone ahead and I've broken all those numbers down. And A.J. Brown is in an incredibly advantageous position going into the 2022 season. And all of the rumors I've heard this offseason have begun to trigger me a bit. In the idea that I've heard that A.J. Brown and Jalen Hurts, they're hanging out after practice, their families are hanging out with each other, they're best friends. The last time I heard about a quarterback and a wide receiver duo being best friends after one of those players was traded to a different team was Matthew Stafford and Cooper Kupp. And we all know how that turned out for that pair. I think there's a very good opportunity for A.J. Brown to not only be a top-tier wide receiver 2, but get back into that wide receiver 1 conversation with a full healthy season in 2022 as one of the most dominant forces in the National Football League. That pretty much does it for today's episode. I want to thank you all for watching. If you have not yet already, of course, be sure to subscribe. Help us get to our goal of 60,000 subscribers. Of course, I'm making fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2022 season. If you have not yet already, do me a favor, click the like button down below and comment down below what you guys think of these respective wide receivers. What other wide receivers within this range? Maybe it's a DJ Moore. Maybe, it's guys like Allen Robinson that you are going after, that you believe are must-draft wide receivers, that you have continued to find drafting in your respective underdog drafts. Again, if you haven't signed up for Underdog Fantasy, be sure to go to the link down in the description and use promo code Andrew. Underdog Fantasy is willing to match up to $100 of your first deposit. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And until tomorrow, I appreciate it, and I'll see you guys. Peace.